right? Who who are very handy, in fact, right? They don't have some tantrums like, no, I'm busy.
Of
Okay,
course not. I mean, this is what we are here for, right? I mean, these kinds
yeah,
of
I hope
exchanges.
so. Pragya, can you hear me? Pragya?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I think we will start exactly after 30 seconds.
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
because it's already, just let me see what. Yeah, it's 2, but after 30 minutes, 30 seconds, we will start it. All right, see you. Okay, Firoz, then we'll get back to you after the talk. Okay.
Sure. All right. I mean, I hope this is going to be a bit more interactive.
Yeah, it will be interesting. Ankita?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great.
A very good afternoon to one and all present. Welcome to online lecture series brought to you by Intersections, Banaras Hindu University. Intersections Banaras Hindu University is an informal academic platform under the aegis of Faculty of Arts, Banaras Hindu University. The purpose of this online lecture series is to address the young minds of scholars, academicians, and mostly PG students and bring about an awareness of the recent and ongoing studies in the sphere of academics. Today we have among us Professor Feroz Hassan, who is currently working as an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Kanpur. Having done his master's and MPhil from English and Foreign Languages University in English Literature, he has done his PhD in uh, in Screen Arts and Cultures from University of Michigan. He has been awarded the prestigious Rackham Spring and Summer Centennial Fellowship by University of Michigan. His research interest lies in history of film theory, aesthetic politics, and world cinema. So, without any further delay, I welcome you, sir. The audience is requested to keep their microphones off and not to share their screen. One can drop their questions or observations during the lecture in the chat box, which I shall read chronologically post lecture during the interactive question answer session. So, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Pragya, right? Yes. Yeah, this is a great opportunity for me to interact with all of you. And it is interesting that I was asked to speak about film studies as a discipline because film studies, whether it is a discipline or not, is itself a question right now. As you may have noticed, my PhD was in a department that called itself Screen Arts and Cultures. It has uh, changed its name recently to Film, Television, and Media. But in any case, this confusion over terminology is a good indication of the fact that perhaps film studies is an area of research rather than a discipline in itself. Okay. In many ways, I mean, if you were to compare it to English, and I'm a faculty member in the English discipline at IIT Kanpur, English also is a vast discipline. It has under its umbrella a range of research projects, a range of research areas, but it retains a certain kind of uh, cohesive identity that perhaps film studies struggles to retain. Uh, that has been my experience. Now, why is that? Uh, if you look at the history of the discipline itself, it seems to us that it started off in humanities disciplines, primarily under English, but its longer history, if you look at it globally, in the US, for example, the history of the discipline actually goes back to the 1930s, 1930s, I think, when universities became interested in cinema, but primarily researchers from the social sciences and in business. Okay. It was not a humanities discipline to begin with. Okay. People were not interested in writing about individual films in order to uh, provide a reading of these films, to provide interpretations. Okay. And if you move to France, over there, again, film studies took a very long time to become a university discipline. But when it did start becoming, when universities started becoming interested in cinema, you had a movement called filmology, 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 which studied cinema from social science perspectives. Okay. Uh, so, having started out within the social sciences, cinema around the 60s and the 70s started acquiring a larger academic profile in the humanities departments, primarily English. And that has continued, but that high point was, let's say, the 60s and the 70s and through the 80s. But from the 80s onwards, you again start seeing a change in how scholars approach cinema. During the high point of film studies as a humanities discipline, you had research programs being driven by the then current theoretical influences coming out of France in particular. Okay. So the kinds of research projects you had were still centered around films, okay, specific films or bodies of films, and you used theoretical paradigms to think about specific films. Okay. Uh, but in the 80s, what happens is that alongside a general crisis in the humanities, film studies encounters two challenges. Okay, one challenge comes from historiography, okay, and this remains with us. Okay, film studies as a discipline centered on individual films, on specific films, encounters a challenge from historiography, from historians who suddenly had access to a lot of film archives that scholars had not had until that point. Okay, so they got to look at a much wider range of films. They got to look at a lot of other material that films generate. Okay. Not only the film reviews, but fan magazines, posters, okay, how films differ uh, when they are shown in one context from how they're shown in another context. Okay. Uh, so, to give you a very to give you an example from personal experience, I grew up in Hyderabad, and we had a few theaters which showed Hollywood films. And I remember watching a Mel Gibson film called Braveheart. I don't know if you know about it, in a particular theater. And then I watched it in another theater in another part of the city. And The film in the second theater was 15 to 20 minutes longer than than the version shown in the first theater. Now, why was that? Okay. So, is it because of the kind of demographic of audience that comes to watch films in these specific theaters? Okay. Do theater owners believe that this material is something that will not be of interest to our spectators, so we can chop it off without them noticing it? Okay. So these kinds of questions become more interesting to film scholars than talking about what Braveheart tells us about Irish nationalism, Scottish nationalism in itself. Okay, so you need to look beyond the film. You need to look beyond the screen in order to understand how films work in a social context. Okay. And that transformed the discipline from one that was heavily theoretically driven to one that started to base itself on more empirical data. Okay. Does not mean that it ceased to be theoretical, okay? But now theory had to be in dialogue with archival material. Okay. So archival research has driven a majority of uh, film studies research projects since the late 80s onwards. Okay, and if you are to study contemporary cinema, there is more attention paid to the kind of discourses that they generate uh, through perhaps ethnographic research or through research that accesses various online fora to sort of gauge the discourse that they develop and so on and so forth. So that is one thing to understand about film studies, that it has gone through a very long trajectory that cuts across disciplines, cuts across categories such as the humanities and the social sciences. Uh, the other challenge I won't speak about much, it came from cognitivist theorists trained in the tradition of analytical philosophy. Now, if you know the distinction between analytic and continental philosophy, the theoretical programs of the 60s and 70s were informed by continental philosophy coming out of Europe. Whereas analytical philosophy, which has a much more prominent presence in the Anglophone world, okay, has a very different approach to philosophy. So you had cognitivist theorists and analytical philosophers taking an interest in cinema. So what used to be film theory, you will probably now find in journals that are dedicated to film philosophy. Okay. So that is another area of film research scholarship. Okay. And then lastly, film is no longer what it was in the 20th century, for most of the 20th century. The advent of home video, then digital technologies, has completely changed both how films are made and how they are seen. Okay. And I think we are experiencing an acceleration of that process now through the pandemic. Okay. So when you watch both a film and uh, a series on the same platform, uh, what is specific to cinema? Does cinema exist as a medium apart from the various media that surround it? Okay. So cinema is now much more closely tied up with other forms of mass media. Okay. So there is an interface between cinema studies and media studies. So that is another thing that must be kept in mind for anybody trying to think of, trying to come up with a research program in relation to cinema. Within India itself, film studies has been informed much more by cultural studies and the kinds of paradigms that cultural studies came up with. Cultural studies is, if I were to simplify it, it's one of its biggest contributions has been to take the focus away from one kind of culture, a culture that prized only certain kinds of texts, to open it up to taking popular culture seriously. So if film studies, when it was trying to gain acceptance in the academy, uh, focused on specific filmmakers, okay, whether it was Ingmar Bergman from Sweden or Jean Renoir or François Truffaut Godard from France. That is what film studies did when it was trying to gain academic acceptability. Okay, specific filmmakers who were considered to be great filmmakers, looking at their films closely. But cultural studies has forced us to look beyond that and take works of popular culture uh, themselves seriously. Okay. It's not just a question of now trying to figure out which film is great or which film is not, and that is not a question that matters. It's a question of understanding how these specific films, a range of films, not just a small set of films, circulate uh, among us and how they shape our imaginaries. So, if you are thinking of taking up research in film, then there are a couple of things that you may want to keep in mind given how research proceeds in this field. You may want to identify specific archives related to the films, the bodies of work that you're interested in. Okay? That kind of work gets uh, a lot of gets scholars' attention. So you may want to be prepared to step out and look for uh, material archives in order to do research. It isn't about simply taking a theoretical paradigm and some films and putting them together. Okay. Uh, and that is something that is going to be a challenge, and I think we should look forward to that challenge in terms of identifying what all archives are out there, both film archives, print archives, and various other kinds of archives. Think about all the kinds of things that cinema generates. Uh, Identifying archives and then identifying sources of funding for that as well as you start taking up research. There are sources of funding, but you have to be prepared to look for them. Uh, Clearly, stepping out, going to different places is going to be more expensive than staying on campus and working. Okay. So that is one thing that you should keep in mind. The other thing, more generally to do with uh, cinema education, media education in India, is that we don't really have many film studies undergraduate programs. You have a few courses here and there being offered, but a sort of a systematic exposure to the work that has come out from the discipline is missing at the undergrad level. Okay. And when I was making that shift from literature to cinema studies, instead of going directly from my MA to the PhD, I decided to do an MPhil on a film-related topic, not thinking that I'm going to be working on some kind of an original topic, an original argument, but simply taking that time to become familiar with the debates that are going on in the discipline, the debates on the topics that I'm interested in. And that stood me in a good stead to take that time and to become familiar before starting my research. Others may or may not need it, but I really feel that once you finish your post graduation, it's a good idea to find some way of taking a year or so, uh, exposing yourself to the scholarship in the discipline. Uh, Again, there are differences in how research is carried out at various institutions. In some institutions, you get to do a lot of coursework, which means that you can take your time trying to figure out all that uh, all that you need to know before you plunge into your research. Okay, but most institutions give you coursework of about a year, if not more. Sorry, probably not more, and that's generally not enough. It's enough if you're one of those people who have a clear idea that this is the one topic that I want to work on. I don't want to look beyond it, and I want to simply focus on getting that done rather than uh, exposing myself to discipline very broadly. If you're that kind of a person, it might very well work for you. So that's for you to decide. I'm simply speaking from my experience. So these are some of the things that I just wanted to share with you, since this is meant to be an informal exchange rather than a formal talk by me on the subject. So I think I will stop there and then sort of open up the forum for discussion, and then I can say more as we go along based on your questions. Is that all right?
Yes, sir. Perfectly.
Okay.
Yeah. Now I invite Priyanka Chakraborty madam for another conversation with you. Hello. Am I audible? Yes, ma'am, you're audible. Thank you. Feroz Hassan for such a lecture. I think this is very beneficial for the students who are looking forward to do some research or at least planning to do something related to film studies. Nowadays, whenever we see film, we are very critical about certain aspects of the film. Just not just as a medium of entertainment, but rather we also see or look at it from theoretical or critical perspectives. So I think having the technical knowledge or having the right knowledge on how to approach will be helpful for them. The first thing that I would like to talk about or would like to talk about will be when we talk about film studies, like as you have just mentioned that it is we need to decide that whether it is a genre in itself or it is the area of this course or it's just a part of it. And I've had film studies in my graduation, and we have seen, and it's very obvious, that many of the film movements, be it German Expressionism, be it Italian Surrealism, or French New Wave, even for Russian also, they are very much deep rooted into theory. And a very like real social cause from which they were developing the films. They were actually medium of their expression and not just a form of entertainment. How theory becomes important when we are doing film studies from the perspective of literature. Because our theories or the way we interpret films are much different than the way these films were being made. And the second thing that I'll be asking you, or I'll be asking rather
film studies. Because we know that when Einstein started using his monitor, the entire idea, there was a revolutionary change in filmmaking. Even when Tom Carr and various other kind of technical terms started getting in, there was some reason why they were using it. It was just not like fun to have certain things. So how this is important when as a student of literature we are reading films and we are critically analyzing films, we need to understand this technical ideas as well. I feel so. So if you can just talk about this, then I can come up with the third one.
So the first question was that how do we look at film movements? Was that the question?
Sort of that, like this film is a very much interesting game. So when we are looking from literature perspective, we look at different theories like theories of hybridity, diaspora, multiculturalism. So how what balance between them?
See, more and more it has become difficult to do research on bodies of work that are not native to the scholars in some way, who are not proficient in the context from which those films emerge. So, for example, if somebody wants to work on, say, New German cinema, what would be interesting to the discipline would be somebody who can talk about New German cinema in relation to all the other kinds of cinema that were coming out of Germany at the time. So not just look at them as works of specific filmmakers, but works within a broader context. Okay, so that is again the historiographic perspective on the subject. As far as the theoretical approaches are concerned, I think it would help if we ground the theory in the broader academic scholarship on the subjects that we are studying. And by academic scholarship, I mean, say, historiography. Okay. And engaging with it in depth, not just skimming it. So rigorous interdisciplinarity rather than an interdisciplinarity that skims the surface. I think that is something that's going to be very important in your approach to the subject. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, sir, definitely. Thank you so much.
And the second part was the significance of the technical aspects of filmmaking. Very important, of course, but it's also doesn't take long to become familiar with it. I remember, I remember correctly, it was Claude Chabrol, one of the French New Wave filmmakers, who said, courses in film schools should last 4 hours. That's all you need. That's all the time you need to learn the technical aspects of filmmaking. And after that, you go out and you try and do something, say something with the technology. Things have become more complicated since then with the advent of digital technology. But in a way, the technical aspects are not very difficult to sort of become familiar with, at least the ones that are relevant to looking at specific films. For somebody interested in the history of film technology, that's a different matter. Okay? Then it becomes more complicated. But if you're simply looking at films as texts, then very important and also not too difficult to access. However, the area that you may need to pay a lot more attention to is the history of film style. How techniques of expression have changed from context to context. I think David Bordwell's History of Film Style is still an excellent book to explore that aspect of film studies. So, technique, yes, but the history of technique will enrich the research program that you develop.
Thank you, sir. Now we move to the question and answer session. So the first question is from my side. Sir, what is your take on the possibility of the influence of Godard on current world cinema, where aestheticism has gone down and commercial aspect has come up instead? Also, can art film regain its popularity?
Okay, so the thing to remember about Godard and all the other French New Wave filmmakers is that they grew up on popular cinema. They did not make this distinction between art cinema and commercial cinema. Okay. They were all, most of them were film critics. And, excuse me, and they were film critics who were at the time lambasted for taking Hollywood seriously, for taking Hollywood filmmakers seriously. Hitchcock was somebody who was considered a mere entertainer. But it was these film critics who sort of made an argument for Hitchcock as a rigorous filmmaker having something specific and personal to say. So that distinction, when it comes to Godard himself, did not was not something that was part of his film viewing experience. The divide actually emerges at the moment when there is a crisis in film going. I'll tell you what I mean by that. So art cinema came up in France, Germany, and all these other places as a way of countering the influence of Hollywood. But the influence of Hollywood would basically mean that Hollywood was able to sell its films for cheap because they had already made money back home. America had a very large audience which could offer returns on these films. So when these films were sold by Hollywood to other countries, they could sell them cheaply. That was the major problem for film industries in the small countries. Okay. So in order to protect local cinema, a lot of these governments came up with these parallel string of theaters called art house theaters. They'd also come up in the US, but these art house theaters were meant to show films without tax-free. They would get tax rebates, so cheaper tickets, which would allow filmmakers to make their money back more easily. Okay. So this commercial art distinction actually has an industrial origin, not an aesthetic origin. Okay. After that, it informed aesthetic styles and so on and so forth. Okay. So the influence of Godard on current world cinema, I think it remains important, but the question is which Godard? The Godard of Breathless, Pierre Le Fou and all those early films, or the Godard of his later career, which a lot of people take that part of his career seriously, but it has not had a significant popular impact. Okay. So Godard is going to remain influential in the time to come, at least in the recent future. I would say it is the Godard of his early career. Can art film regain its popularity? I think you have so many more venues where you can show films now that it has become possible for filmmakers to make all kinds of films, and we have seen a lot of interesting films come out over the past few years. So, yes, something like what you call art cinema, independent cinema, has its space and will continue to have that space in the years to come, certainly.
Thank you, sir. So the next question is from Aryaputri Sitapragyan. She asks, as we know that through movies we represent our culture and tradition, we can use subtitles in order to convey the meaning, but can we convey the kind of cultural traits and understanding we have regarding our culture to the audiences who are very much unfamiliar to these? And sir, why the regional movies are not getting the same kind of attention and respect as the mainstream movies that are getting, and when can we expect this to change?
Question of subtitles is a very good question. We all wonder about how much can you say in a subtitle. In a book, you can always add footnotes. So, if you're reading a 19th century novel from a culture that you're unfamiliar with, the footnotes would supply the context, but subtitles cannot do that job. If anything, they are designed to condense the information so that they don't distract you too much from the image. So that limitation is built into viewing subtitled films. But I think, as with novels from other cultures that we read, you do have to dig a little deeper around the text to become familiar with those kinds of nuances. So, for example, if you're watching a film from Turkey and you notice something that you think is very specific to that culture, and if that is of interest, then the expectation is that you are going to try and find out more about it. So the point is to first make whatever it is that you are offering interesting, and then hope that audiences can build upon that interest. So that's about all I can say. It's a very large topic, subtitles and film viewing. Maybe we can have a discussion on that, a larger discussion on that at some other point. Regional movies are not getting the same kind of attention and respect. Okay, firstly, the opposition over here is between regional movies and mainstream movies. Now, regional movies are also mainstream movies. Can also be mainstream movies. That is what is being called commercial cinema over here. So that opposition in itself does not hold. And again, what do we mean by? Okay, let's not get into that. I'll tell you one thing. This may not be what the answer that you're looking for, but I was at a restaurant in the US and an Indian restaurant, and the waiters over there, of course, talked to us, saying that we're Indians, and the young guys from Punjab. And then we asked them, so what films do you watch? Okay, so sorry, they first asked me where you're from, and I said I was from Hyderabad, and they said they love Telugu films. And I was shocked. These guys from Punjab claiming that they watch only Telugu or other South Indian mainstream cinema. And I asked them why, and they said, well, those are the ones that seem interesting to us. The Hindi films these days aren't particularly interesting. Uh, and here is a possible research project. Trying to think about why that is the case. Uh, so I don't think regional films, or what we call regional films, do not have exposure outside of their specific regions now, especially now with streaming platforms and so on. There is a great opportunity for these films to have an audience outside of their language groups, okay, with subtitle versions and so on and so forth. So I actually feel that regional films do have a very strong profile in the country. I don't know, you may feel differently about it. But
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Shurab Sharkar. He asks, Sir, does the language of film differs from the spoken or written language? If yes, then how?
There are whole books around this topic, so I don't think I can answer it in any kind of a comprehensive manner. But when people started thinking about film as language, they started doing it as part of the general theoretical interest in the generalization of linguistic theory to all kinds of discourse. Okay. So the idea of difference and the difference between signified and signified, those kinds of things were being used to talk about all kinds of things. So, for example, a book that a lot of people might still find of great interest is Roland Barthes' Mythologies, where he takes all kinds of objects of culture, such as a boxing match, and think of it in terms of what it communicates to the audience, what it communicates to its consumers. So, if you are to think of film as language, then you would be on very strong ground. But is it like spoken or written language? I don't know if I can. I would suggest you, for starters, check out this book by Christian Metz called Film Language. It's still I think it still reads very well, even though it has its limitations. I think that's a good place to start if you want to think about film and language. Christian Metz, I just...
Thank you, sir. Sir, if you could opine on the issues addressed in the movie Thappad, and do movies like Thappad are complete waste and they should not be promoted? It is from Pragya Dev.
I haven't actually watched Thappad, but of course I know what it is about, and I have been meaning to watch it. Why? Could you say a little more about why you think films like Thappad are complete waste and they should not be promoted? Pragya, do you mind saying a little more about it?
Am I audible, sir?
Hello?
Yes, sir. Actually, what I wanted to ask was that, the movie Thappad addresses some domestic violence, and it is
Yes.
merely reduced to the question is just a slap, but even that is permissible or not. There are many critics who talk in favor that there are certain breakthrough moments where people just lose their temper and they do it. But divorce should not be the ultimate
solution to it. Like that shouldn't be the ultimate thing. Like if anybody slaps you, you just need to divorce him or her. Like the issue is addressed in that manner.
Well, that's a separate question from the film itself in some ways, right? I mean, the film might take a particular position, but I think it's the manner in which it takes that position is what makes it interesting rather than the bottom line argument of what it is trying to say. So I will be able to say more about it once I watch the film, but really what you're saying is a question that exceeds the film. So I certainly think that it's a very significant issue to be addressed through cinema or otherwise. The idea that who is allowed to and who is asked to put up with violence. This is a very important question when you think about gender relations. So it is not a topic that can be dismissed. So there is the topic, there is the film, how they come together is something that I can say more about only once I watch the film, but I certainly feel that the topic itself cannot be dismissed.
Thank you, sir. So the next question is from Orno Panda. He asks, Sir, can you please tell us something on the use of camera as a kind of aid that is inherently informed by some kind of ideology or the other, and how to understand the camera work like close shots and shots taken from a certain angle?
Okay. So film technique does not have a meaning in itself. To take the most simple example, there used to be a time when students were taught that if the camera is looking at a character, it means that the character in some ways has a great influence on the action that is unfolding. If the camera looks down on a character, it means that the character is powerless. It simply does not work like that. Film technique does not have meaning in itself. It is all context specific. There is the context of the film itself, the narrative, and other kinds of things. Other aspects of the mise-en-scène, what is in the frame. Okay. And then there are culturally specific factors as well. Okay. So film technique cannot be taken to have any kind of absolute meaning. Whether it is invariably informed by some kind of ideology, well, everything in discourse and social relations is informed by ideology. Now, ideology is a word that is generally used to mean something that has a negative balance, that is oppressive, but that need not be. Ideology is simply that frame of reference that we draw upon unconsciously in the way we discourse in society. Okay. And again, it's the balance that you give to it. It's all again context specific. So yes, ideology is certainly at work in film technique as well. But I would encourage you to think about ideology as having a much. We cannot live outside of ideology. We can only try and become familiar with the ideologies that inform us. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, sir. So the next question is from Kufri Dash. She asks, Sir, do you think that literary narratives
can imitate or get influenced by filming or camera techniques. For instance, some of Eliot's poems seem to have adopted the montage technique while trying to bring home the concept of fragmentation. How does filmic techniques contribute to the visual auditory aspects in literary pieces?
Okay. Uh, can literary narratives imitate or get influenced by filming or camera techniques? Yes, but it's also true the other way around. If Eisenstein in some ways seem to have informed modernist poetry, there are actually scholars who have made the argument that a lot of film technique actually built upon the work of modernist writers, like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce. Okay. So it's a question of who influenced whom. I think the influence could be traced in both directions. So modernist narrative and modernist poetry and modernist literature has influenced film technique, and film technique in some ways may have reinforced certain modernist trends. Eisenstein himself draws upon the example of Dickens. Dickens may not be a modernist writer, but he finds montage at work in Dickens as well. So you then have to ask yourself whether Eisenstein is simply reading montage into Dickens, or was he in some ways informed by Dickens in thinking about montage? So yeah, the traffic is in both directions. It's not one-way traffic.
Thank you, sir. Kachi Chauhan asks, Sir, when we analyze a text, literary text basically, we do take into account author as an agency, their association with the text. Can the same technique be used while analyzing a film for research? If yes, how can it be done and what all to take into account?
Okay, the focus on the filmmaker used to be the focus on the filmmaker as a way of studying a body of work used to be what we may know about it, author theory. So, for example, when the French New Wave critics wrote about Hitchcock, they said that Hitchcock was an author. That is, he had something specific and personal to say, which you can find across all of his films. But that approach came to be criticized heavily for a range of reasons. But you still find monographs published these days on single filmmakers. But what has changed is the approach to the author as an individual. We no longer think of the author as a separate individual. We think of an author as a place where the broader context in which they work makes an impression. So one has to avoid that trap of falling into biography and simply personal expression when you're talking about an author. You have to find a connection between the author and the larger context that indirectly speaks through the work produced by individuals. Okay. And at a more basic level, filmmaking is a collective process. It's a collective process with heavy investment. by people who are not necessarily the filmmaker. So, even at a very literal level, you have to understand that decisions, all expressive decisions, cannot be traced back to the author. And even in literature, I'm sure we all offer readings of books that the author themselves may not agree with. You may say, "This is not what I intended to say." Okay? But our response generally is, "You may not have intended it, but these sentences in this context, put in this manner, mean this. Whether you want it to or not doesn't matter." So one has to avoid the trap of authorial intention, but we can certainly speak about the work of specific individuals, so long as we place them in a broader context.
Thank you, sir. Kamal Kandan asks, for a researcher of film, the language of cinema is more important than the technology involved in actual filmmaking. More than the process, the product is very important. Please give your views on this.
I think sort of go back to the earlier question about film technique. We can sort of link that to this question as well. Yes, what is important is the product, okay, but knowing about the process could certainly change the way we think about the product. Okay. So, to give you an example, a lot of documentaries that started coming out in the 1960s that were called direct cinema or cinema verite were made possible by new camera technologies that were portable, that allowed people to shoot on the move as well as record sound on the move. That wasn't possible until the late 1950s and early 1960s. And that completely changed. I won't say completely changed, that certainly changed the way some films were made. Okay? They changed what kinds of films were made. So we cannot understand how certain films came to be made without understanding the changes in technology that went on behind them. Technology does not explain the films entirely. No single factor can. So one has to draw a balance between sort of looking behind the screen, as it were, a little bit, as well as looking around the context.
Thank you, sir. Kritesh Patel asks, is it possible that commercial cinema can evoke the same level of discourse in the audience as they are evoked by documentary cinema?
Could you give me an example, Ish? What do you mean? What do you have a documentary film in mind? Is Kritesh still with us?
Anita, ask the next question.
The next question, sir.
Okay.
Hello, Filipino joined. Yeah.
Hello, sir, what did you ask?
Yeah, I just wanted to. Could you give me an example of what kind of documentary film you have in mind?
I'm talking about like Amit Datta or Deepak Chopra or like documentaries.
I'm actually I'm not familiar with them. So, what kinds of films are these?
Basically, these are films based on the documentary, which was by Deepa Dhandas, is basically on female subjects like their marriages and other things. And Amit Datta is basically focused on art films like Nansu, that is on what you say on painting. Okay. So I'm just asking, like, there was a question related to Thappad. Like, is it possible that Thappad is like loss of money and all? So I'm asking you, is it possible that documentary filmmaking, like documentary films, are better than commercial cinema in aspect of like evoking discourse and audience?
Okay.
Is it possible that cinema, basically commercial cinema, can also evoke the same level of discourse that is like evoked by documentary films?
Of course, yes. The simple answer is yes, but can it address social issues in a manner that is complex? I assume that is what you're trying to ask. Whether, and the assumption over here is that documentary cinema can address social issues in a much more complex manner than mainstream cinema does. See, commercial cinema may or may not address social issues in as complex a way on the face of it. Okay, but as a critic, as a scholar, you can delve into these films to understand something about the issue that they're treating. Okay, why is it that, I mean, if you look at most research scholarship on Indian cinema, it is on mainstream cinema. Okay. Clearly, these scholars have found that these films are a good way of understanding how these social issues play out among the audiences of the film or in the societies from which these films emerge. Okay, and beyond that, of course, the level of discourse is depending on the people involved in the discourse as well. So I think that's about all I can say. That commercial cinema, mainstream cinema, can also deal with the complexity of social issues. If not directly, then maybe they give us enough to work with when we think about these issues.
Thank you, sir. So,
By the way, just one last thing that I'd like to say. Maybe we should not confuse the ability of how these films engage with the social issues with our agreement or disagreement with them. Okay. That is not as important. Okay. It is one factor in how we think about it. Some of the most fruitful discussions start with films that we dislike. Okay. So yeah, that's better.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
So the next question is from Feroz Hassan. He asks, Sir, should a scene from a movie which is composed of many visual idioms be analyzed in a paper in the same way as paragraph from a novel is analyzed?
Should be, I don't know. It depends on your research project and what you're trying to say. But can it be? Yes, of course. Yes, it can.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
And the next question is from my side. So, what's your take on item number songs in the commercial film of India as a whole? And do you see any near possibility of Bollywood not featuring it anytime soon, since it contributes to the devaluation of women in society?
अच्छा खाना बनाना
I'm not. How to answer this? This posed a difficult question for me. Do I see any possibility of films not having them? Probably not. But not every film has item songs. But as a research scholar, maybe you can, look into why item songs, what we call item songs, started appearing in films at a certain point in film history. Okay. So again, one has to, as a scholar, as a research scholar, you must learn to, in a way, postpone your own judgments on the subject that you're studying. Okay. You should look at the topic on its own merits. So maybe just go back and look at why item numbers started appearing.
Thank you, sir.
Would you say that Helen's songs? Sorry, go ahead. I think Vivek is trying to say something.
Yeah.
I was thinking that certain questions like India asked about the movie Kappad, and Gita asked about the movie called Item Number. They are more into these kind of a question addressing the problem for gender, which film studies as a cultural text trying to address. So I think film studies has a few dimensions. The one which film as a text, and one is that the narrativization of the film. So one becomes film as a text. The second kind of narrativity of the film is, let's say for example, look at we have questions by Arnold about the camera, right? So what is the role of the camera and what kind of prophetic and analytic kind of technical things are there, right? So it seems like you started by saying that film studies is not exactly outcome, but yes, a lot of things was contributed by cultural studies. So when we are looking at the movie, when we are looking at item number, when we are looking at these kinds of social political text, we need to also see that the gender perspective from the cultural studies perspective, and you are doing, let's say, research in film studies, your job becomes more difficult in the sense that you need to also understand the way film is produced. Right? The way film is produced, like the method of producing film becomes also important. Right? Let's say for the character you see, right? It becomes larger than hero. Become larger than persona. So these things are not. These are all the cultural productions where camera is also contributing. So it is. If you are interested in talking about those things, we can pull in a particular text which talks about that. How a film was produced in a particular country. Let's say, for example, we're talking about the item number, right? So, for example, if I have to pose a question, let's say, when we see IPL, right? How do you look at, like, I've been to be telecasted just like yesterday was done in Royal Bangalore and so on and so forth. And then second thing, second is second what we find in the movies. How do you look at one side there's a terminology called there's everyone item numbers. Second, very important is I'm sure that we have some Dhoni fan. I hope that we will do this details related to arts. When Dhoni retired, I could see that there was a huge number of people who were very sad. It seems to them that the cricket has like collapsed. It seems that there's no hero anymore. It seems like after Dhoni, there's no other hero as well. The question is not the question which critically has to be raised. Who is Dhoni, right? I'm asking a person from Jharkhand. Came a cricketer.
IIT Kanpur.
So, given the image of Dhoni through history, right? The kind of let's say, for example, if they do not have television where people are broadcasting IPL or World Cup, it created the same kind of emotion. The way it did without television. The simple answer is no. The simple answer is no. Right? So, see, I'm not saying that don't know about cricketer. I'm not talking about it. That is a different thing. What I'm saying that you created Dhoni, right? And like if you talk about the people who will say that there are n number of good cricketers, for example, the West Indies players, there are people. People don't get emotions for them not because they are good, but because the kind of emotion that was created, that was structured, why builds up. Technologies are also important. One must analyze, one must look into it. Right? So these are like points I wanted to mention so that my students should not get distracted. Right? They should not get diverted. What are the points which they need to critically think when they are engaging in particular institutions? I mean, talking about cultural studies and film, but I think I'll ask Feroz to comment.
And I completely agree with what you said just now, and in a way that was also what I was trying to get at. That yes, we have certain stance on certain films, on certain figures like Dhoni, but you have to not completely keep them aside, but postpone imposing them on these phenomena that you're studying. Okay. So go back and look at the history of item numbers. Okay. If cultural studies has done something, it has allowed for a lot of papers to be written about how something that we think of as generally oppressive might actually be used as part of an act of resistance. Okay. So maybe there are papers out there which talk about item numbers in a way that rather than talk about the objectification of women or the devaluation of women might talk about them as in some ways clarifying some aspect of gender relations or sexuality that otherwise does not come to the fore. Okay. So the item number may be tied up with a lot of other phenomena alongside the question of whether they devalue women or not.
Okay, thank you, sir, for the wonderful talk. Now I invite B.H.U Chatterjee for the formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, Ankita. A very good afternoon to one and all present here. I, on behalf of Intersections Banaras Hindu University, extend profound gratitude to all those who have assisted in achieving such a pronounced outcome of this lecture. Firstly, I must mention our deep sense of appreciation and sincere thanks to our chief speaker, Dr. Feroz Hassan. Thank you, sir, for your reinvigorating and intriguing talk on Workshop on Film Studies, where you talked about the technicalities that are required in film studies and how one can prepare themselves if setting out to research in film studies, along with many such insightful points. I would like to take this opportunity to place on record our hearty thanks to Dr. Vivek Singh. Sir, it's solely because of your motivation, support, and guidance at- extended to all of us that we are able to hear such preeminent and prestigious intellectuals. Thank you, sir. I also extend my thanks to all the participants for their gracious presence and enormous cooperation. Thank you.
Well, I should thank all of you as well for inviting me, as well as taking the time out to listen to me. So this was, I love the experience, and I think platform is a great idea. Intersection sounds like a wonderful idea, and thank you for allowing me to participate.